There are days where my job takes me to the darkest corners of the world, revealing truths I'm uncertain whether to believe or not. But this tale is the strangest of them all, and I need your audience to hear it. My name is Stan Levine, and I'm a freelance journalist. Somewhere along the way, my inquisitive nature led me to the infamous town of Roswell, New Mexico. I arrived there last year to dig into the tantalizing UFO sightings that have haunted the town since 1947. The mysteries of the skies intrigued me greatly, perhaps even more than I'd like to admit. I remember the morning I arrived. The whole landscape was dry and parched under the searing New Mexico sun. It was so hot. The ground was cracked like it had been baked in an oven. To be honest, I was skeptical about my job out here. Was any of it legitimate, or were these just tales spun by the science fiction community? As I rolled into the town in my beat-up Chevrolet, I promised myself to find the truth, whatever it may be. The belief in the existence of the extraterrestrial had flooded this town. I figured I was going to be the one to finally debunk the myths and legends around here once and for all. I spent the first couple of days getting settled in, talking to locals, visiting alleged sighting spots, and examining what was referred to as evidence of extraterrestrial activities. I spent hours interviewing people who claimed to have had encounters. Their stories were strange, spooky, and often far from being scientifically plausible. Either half of the town was delusional or something eerie was afoot. Now, the really strange part happened one night when I was about 5 days into my investigation. After a tiring day of interviews and on-site sleuthing around, I was heading back to my motel. The night was eerily quiet. As I walked down a deserted road, I felt watched. Suddenly, there was a rustling sound somewhere off in the near distance. My heart pounded in response. Sweaty palms, rapid pulse, the whole shebang. I stood frozen for what felt like an eternity, trying to convince myself it was just a coyote or some other desert critter. But then, I saw it. It was big, way too big to be any ordinary animal that lives in these parts. The vague silhouette lurked at the edge of the streetlight's reach, its shape constantly shifting and blurring, as if being distorted by waves of hot air. Looming at probably 10 feet, its posture bristled with aggression. I still wasn't quite sure what I was looking at. When I squinted, I could distinguish two eyes glowing like a pair of coals against the darkness. Whatever it was, it stood there, watching me intently. My heart pounded like a drum in my chest and my breath hitched. Fear, primal and raw, suggested I run, but I was frozen to the ground, unable to move. I stood transfixed, as if bound by an invisible force. Every instinct in me railed to take a step back, to leave, to run. I waited there for a moment. Neither of us moved until I started retreating back. I ended up walking the rest of the way to the motel, constantly looking over my shoulder for the strange creature. My heart was still pounding hours later. A part of me knew it wasn't the last I was going to see of it. The next few days were a blur of uncertainty. I found myself constantly glancing around, my senses perpetually on edge. Every shadow seemed to conceal that figure I had seen, yet I saw nothing out of the ordinary for some time. But that was all about to change. During one of my interviews with the local group of UFO enthusiasts, Nick and Lita, something caught my attention outside the window. I paused mid-sentence and ran over to the window. There, by the edge of the thick scrubland, was a flash of movement. I excused myself promptly, curiosity pushing uncertainty aside as I headed towards the source. As I neared closer, what I saw made my blood turn cold. I stood gazing at a towering figure bathed in the half-light of the setting sun. It was entirely covered in scales, like a snake or a lizard. My breath hitched as its yellow eyes met mine. It had an uncanny dinosaur-like head, but its body was more humanoid. It might have been my hysteria talking, but there was more than hostility in its posture. Curiosity, perhaps? Understanding, even? As if an unseen accord passed between us, I took a step forward towards it. It did not retreat. The creature, as horrifying as it was, appeared to be sentient. While I stood there, lost in a silent exchange with God knows what, my phone buzzed. Startled, I looked away for a second. By the time I looked up, the creature, or alien, or whatever, had vanished. I searched the scrubland, but there were no tracks, no signs of a struggle, nothing. It was as if it had evaporated into thin air. The only fact I had to prove its existence was my memory, as unreliable as it can be. I was left questioning everything, my own sanity above all. I knew I had seen something extraordinary out there, and yet, in the warmth of the morning sun, it felt absurd, even to me. When I shared the incident with Nick and Lita, they didn't throw incredulous glances my way as I thought they would. Instead, they nodded in understanding. Through them, I learned of others who had similar encounters with this thing. More than you would think. It's not the skies in Roswell that you have to watch out for. There are strange beasts that live on the ground level with you and me. Nobody knows what they want, but you better keep your head about you when you're out there in the desert. You never know what you're going to find. I'd like to share an experience from about 5 years ago. It was back in the summer of 2016, and it was a day I'll never forget. I found myself standing in front of the notorious Waverly Hills Sanatorium in Kentucky. The number of horror stories attached to that place is enough to make your skin crawl. But I had it in mind that I was cut from a different cloth. Exploring abandoned buildings had become a bit of a pastime for me, especially ones that accompanied a good ghost story. But this one was different. I had a personal stake. My grandmother had worked there as a nurse before the place was shut down, and I just had to see it for myself. I remember it well. My journey began on a hot afternoon. It was one of those days that's just so hot, your clothes stick to you. The first step inside the sanatorium felt like stepping into a different time. Dry leaves filled the halls and birds had taken up roost in the ceilings and windowsills. The silence in the building was a character of its own. It was this ever-present thing that seemed to follow me around from room to room. This place was once a critical haven during the TB epidemic, but now it was decrepit and decaying in solitude. Walking through the deserted halls, I could almost see the hustle of patients and doctors that once filled this building. The worn-out walls, the faded wallpapers, and the stained tiles had seen so much life and death. If only this place could talk, I thought to myself. I continued on my walk. After a while, I found a room filled with old, discarded medical equipment. The rusted bed frames, dilapidated wheelchairs, and broken bottles seemed to desperately hold on to their purpose. I remember distinctly standing in front of an old, drained hydrotherapy tub. I had heard tales of these tubs from Grandma, about how they were filled with ice-cold water to reduce the patient's high temperature. And then, the weirdest thing happened. As I stretched my hand to touch the tub's corroded surface, I felt a sudden chill. The room was still hot, but I felt the hair on my arms stand on end. I shook it off, blaming my nerves for running wild in such an intimidating place. But as I delved further into the building, the temperature kept dropping. I kept hearing these distant sounds. They were hard to make out at first, but started becoming more clear as I ventured deeper into the building. At one point, I was sure I heard a child sobbing. As a father myself, it was that empathetic part of me that decided to investigate the noise. I followed the crying through the corridor, pausing every now and then to make sure I was going in the right direction. All of a sudden, a calming scent filled the room. It was a perfume of some sort, a fragrance of lilacs that seemed so out of place here. It was like something my grandmother would wear. I was beginning to fear that I wasn't alone in this run-down building. I continued towards the source of the crying, but every time I took a step forward, the sound seemed to move a step back. It was like a twisted game of cat and mouse. Following a gut feeling, I moved towards one of the small rooms that were used as patient quarters. I stepped inside and the crying echoed louder in the hollow space. Hesitantly, I slowly turned my flashlight towards the room. The beam cut through the darkness. At first, I couldn't see clearly because of the dust particles in the air, but once they settled, I saw something absolutely horrifying. My flashlight landed on a small figure huddled in the middle of the room. My blood ran cold when I realized what it was. In front of me was a translucent figure of a little girl. She wasn't real like you and me, but she was there, and her crying was as real as it gets. She wore a faded gown that hung loosely on her thin frame. Her eyes were hollow and infinitely sad. She twisted her hands together as she whimpered softly. "Hello," I called out hesitantly. As soon as the words left my mouth, she looked up, finally noticing my presence. Her hands flew up to wipe her eyes. She opened her mouth as if to respond, but no words came out, and only a low moan filled the room. My legs felt like lead, but I took a step towards her. Can you hear me?" I asked again. This time she nodded. The next moments were a blur of fear and adrenaline. I tried asking questions, but her mute nods and head shakes were the only answers I had. I asked if she was alone, if she needed help. At this, she merely lowered her head, the sadness in her eyes deepening, and then she vanished. She was just, all of a sudden, gone. I stood there stunned for I don't know how long. When I finally came to my senses, I was alone again. No signs of the ghost girl or any other apparitions. I returned home, unable to shake off the encounter from my mind. Was that little girl indeed a ghost? What happened to her? And how long has she been trapped in that place? I've heard tales of ghosts and spirits, but this was more real and more frightening than any of the stories I had come across. Sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark, I still feel a ghostly presence around. The desperation in her hollow eyes still haunts me. Part of me wishes I could have helped her, or done something to ease her suffering. But the other part knows full well that there are some things you don't mess around with in this world, and the spirit world is one of them. I guess you could say I'm a bit of a loner type. Always preferred quiet and solitude over noise and people. That's why I took off up to the Canadian Rockies for my latest adventure. I set out one spring morning, intent on immersing myself in the great outdoors for a week or so, maybe more. I didn't have any solid plans. I just figured I would go wherever the road took me. Hiking is more of a meditation for me than anything else, and the Rockies, with their vast wilderness and rugged terrain, was a near spiritual retreat. My path took me around a long hiking trail along the Alberta-British Columbia border. I followed it for a couple of days until I stumbled upon an isolated spot nestled amidst a section of towering pines, overlooking a beautiful glacial-fed lake. It was one of those places you'd think only exists on postcards, but there I was, standing right in front of it. I found a spot of flat ground to pitch my tent, right in front of the lake. I was looking forward to waking up to that view. The walk was well worth it in my opinion. The trail to get there was rough, and after dragging my bones through the wilderness all day, I was eager to set up camp and just enjoy the place. Once the tent was up, I set about gathering wood for a fire and rocks to create a ring to house the blaze. Once everything was set, I nestled up by the fire, munching away at some canned beans. The crackling of the flame was the only sound echoing in the tranquil forest. Soon I was in my sleeping bag, cozy as could be in my two-man tent. I was just on the edge of drifting into that blissful sleep when I heard it. It was faint at first. I thought it could be the wind or the rustling of the trees, but then it grew louder, a repetitive, heavy thud, like something was knocking powerfully on wood. Being quite far out from other campers, it was unnerving to say the least. I'd experienced various nocturnal sounds on my past trips, but this was different. This felt calculated, intentional almost. It sent a chill down my spine. I burrowed deeper into my sleeping bag, pulling the fabric right up to my eyes, straining my ears to make sense of the sounds. Shaking off the initial traces of fear, I reminded myself I was in the wild. There are all sorts of creatures out here with me, and most of them harmless. But the sounds didn't stop there. A low whooping sound echoed through the night. It wasn't any animal I knew. I was sure I heard something moving around outside my tent, as if I was being circled. I knew I was in trouble then. Prey animals don't circle around things. That's only something a predator would do, and only when it was on the hunt. Something in the air changed. It became dense, almost suffocating. A new smell, something rancid and off-putting, began to permeate the tent. There was an undercurrent of something tangy and rotten. It was so strong I couldn't help but silently gag. My heartbeat pounded in my ears like a drum, every nerve in my body prickling with fear. Then, and I swear to you on everything I love, something shuffled past my tent. It was right outside. I hesitated for a moment and then finally, real slow-like, I cracked the zipper on the tent. It was nearly pitch black outside with the only light coming from the low embers of the fire. Rummaging through my backpack, I found my flashlight. There, barely 15 feet away from my tent, was the creature. This was no bear or any other creature I'd ever seen. This thing stood upright like a man, but it was no man. It must have been 6 or 7 feet tall and was covered in a deep, reddish-brown mass of thick, curly fur. Its arms hung down its sides, ending in long, gnarled fingers. The flashlight beam moved upwards, and I took in the details of its face. Similar to man's, maybe, but unmistakably wild and different. Deep-set, sunken eyes and bulky-looking jaw, with a prominent forehead. It seemed to have longer hair on its head, but there was nothing around its face. It was like I was looking at those evolution drawings. This thing looked like it had been caught in the middle. Not quite a man and not quite an ape. After a long nightmarish moment, the beast turned and walked away. Its steps were heavy and unhurried, a stark contrast to the pounding in my chest. It seemed to acknowledge me there, but it didn't give me a second thought. I stopped breathing until I could no longer hear its movements in the distant trees. I sat awake throughout that night waiting for it to come back. When dawn finally broke, I stepped out of my tent, scanning the surroundings for any signs of the previous night's ordeal. I just couldn't believe what I saw. I searched for footprints, anything that would point to tangible proof of my frightening encounter. But apart from a few broken branches, I found nothing. It was like the entire wilderness around me had reset itself. It left me to question the reality of the night before. The day after was spent in fear and quiet fascination for the wild. I stayed at the camp for another day, waiting for the creature to show up again, but it never did. When I returned to civilization, I scoured the internet for answers. The descriptions matched Sasquatch. There were no other creatures it could have been. The location seemed plausible. But honestly, I don't know who would believe me. It has left me with an unquenchable curiosity, a connection to the world that few can understand. It changed how I see the wild, how I see myself. The Rockies somehow seem even bigger now, and full of hidden secrets. So, that's my story. Crazy as it may seem, it's the most real thing I've ever experienced. I remember the night like it was yesterday. It was 2 years back in the dead of summer, and I was in Michigan visiting a few friends around Lake Superior. The whole day had been filled with great food, laughter, and the best company. I really fell in love with the place. Those lakes, they are more like seas. You can stand at the edge and look across the water, and you won't see any sign of land at all. It's hard to describe unless you've been there and seen it for yourself. Those waters are absolutely colossal. We were all still on the beach when night fell around us. We were so entranced in conversation that we either didn't care or didn't notice. There's something otherworldly about Lake Superior at night, with the moonlight reflecting off its surface, and the way the waves gently lap against the shoreline. We had a bonfire going, and we showed no signs of turning in for the night. At some point, we were daring each other to go in the water. If you've never been to Superior, the water is frigid, even in the summer months. It's like jumping into a bucket of ice. I was the first to go. The moment my toes hit the water, I was shaking, but that didn't stop me. It seemed a little less cold when I fully submerged myself, or maybe the shock was just wearing off. The water was still, and I could see the moon's silvery light bouncing off the water as I swam. I was lost in this serene beauty, utterly oblivious to the world around me. I swam out a ways from the beach, and suddenly I was overcome by a weird sensation of being watched. I looked around, but I couldn't see much of anything in the dark. I tried to shrug it off and continue my swim, but it wouldn't leave me alone. With my heart beginning to beat audibly faster, I decided to make my way back to shore. Maybe it was just the cold getting to me, or maybe it was something else. However, just as I was about to turn around, I heard something that froze me in place. A snarl, like a dog, echoed off the water's surface. I circled around in place, trying to find the source of the noise, but I couldn't see anything. Not long after the chilling growl, a smell began to waft towards me. It was something rancid, like old rotten garbage you'd find in a city alleyway. It was so pungent it made my eyes water. The sudden intensity was unbearable. I knew something strange was nearby, but I was still unaware of its identity. I could barely muster the courage to turn around, towards the smell. In the distance, on the shoreline, I could make out a dark silhouette. It was huge and human-like in form, but even in the dim lighting, I could tell that it was anything but. As I squinted to see better, I could hear my heart pounding in my chest. This wasn't just a trick my eyes were playing on me in the dark. This was something real, something undeniably real. And what's worse, it was moving towards me. It was still on land, but it had locked its gaze on me. I had no doubt this thing would get in the water to reach me, so I started swimming for the beach and the safety of the bonfire in the distance. The creature came into clearer view as it made its way down to the water. It was huge. It appeared to be able to walk on both 2 legs and 4. It was on 4 legs now as it headed into the water. If I didn't know better, I would say it was a wolf. But when you really look at it, you can tell there is something wrong. The hind legs were a mixture of a man's leg and a dog's leg. They were larger than the front legs, so the creature walked similar to a bear when it was down on 4 legs. But it had the unmistakable head of a wolf. If that wasn't bad enough, it had these yellow eyes that glowed like yellow flames. I had heard of the dog man before, but I had never believed the stories. But what else could this be? That was the only description it matched. I didn't know much about the stories at the time, or whether or not this thing was dangerous, but I don't think it had good intentions as it pursued me into the water. Adrenaline pumped through my veins as I splashed frantically to the shore. If I could just make it to the fire, I would find safety in numbers. Whatever the creature truly was, I couldn't imagine it attacking a large group like that, even if it were the most dangerous predator on the planet. Suddenly, I was back on the shore, and that horrible stench finally gave way to the smell of crackling wood and burnt marshmallows. But the sight of the dog man wasn't something I could shake so easily. My friends tried to shake me out of my frightened state, thinking that I had seen a bear, or worse, imagined the whole thing in a hypothermic hallucination. To this day, none of them believed me, but I know what I saw. I know it was real. I want to tell you about an experience I had last summer that still gives me the chills when I think about it. It happened one sunny July day in the Appalachian Trail. I'm a bit of an outdoors enthusiast. Hiking, camping, kayaking, you name it, I've tried it. However, what happened that day was way out of my comfort zone and anything but regular. Hiking wasn't something new for me. I had explored countless trails alone before, but that day was different. I was set on visiting some sections of the Appalachian Trail. I've always been drawn to that part of the world. I love the sense of solitude and oneness with the surroundings it offers. But on this particular day, everything went sideways. I began my trek after a hearty breakfast and loaded up my backpack with all the essentials and a mental list of landmarks I wanted to capture with my camera. Little did I know what lay ahead. You may think you are prepared for anything, but nature does its best to catch you off guard, and that's precisely what happened to me. As I got deeper into the trail, I accidentally wandered off the marked path. At first, I wasn't all that worried. As I said, I'm an experienced hiker. I figured I would just retrace my steps. But as I started back, nothing looked familiar anymore. The trees started to close in, and the tweet of birds started to fade, as if they were swallowed up by the dense wilderness. That's when my heart started pounding. Suddenly, the serene woods seemed ominous. It wasn't supposed to be like this. A chill ran down my spine, but I tried to brush it off and focus on making my way back to the trail. The tranquility I had once admired now felt like a dreadful silence. I couldn't quell the fluttering feeling of unease, creeping in the pit of my stomach. I tried to remind myself of all those survival shows I used to binge watch, the tips and tricks I had gathered over the years. I kept walking, but with growing apprehension. As I continued in what I thought was the direction back, I heard something. At first, I thought it was the rustling leaves or some harmless critter, but then I heard it again. It was a sound unlike any I had heard before in a forest. It was a strange clicking sound. I froze in my tracks, straining my ears, hoping I had imagined it. But there it was again, only it was louder and much closer this time. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, goosebumps pricking my skin. I had no idea what was making that noise, and my imagination began painting terrifying scenarios in my head. I noticed a strange path in front of me. It descended into a heavily veiled, hidden part of the forest. I approached the entrance and noticed it was wide enough for me to pass through. Not completely without fear, I cautiously moved forward, clutching my small pocket knife. I didn't know it then, but I was about to experience the most terrifying encounter of my life. Suddenly, right in front of me, there was a grotesque figure. It looked human in a way, but there was something terribly wrong with it. The creature, about 6 feet tall, darted around like some ravaged wild animal. It was completely naked and so ghastly looking that it took all my strength not to scream. Its body was gone and sickly pale. Its skin was so white that it seemed to glow. Its hideous face featured 2 enormous black eyes that lacked any and all expression. The creature had a gaping open mouth and was making a teeth-chattering rhythmic clicking sound. Terrified, I scurried away, only for the creature to bolt after me, moving on all fours at unnerving speed. With me trying to lose myself in the winding paths of the forest, the creature chased barely a stride behind. At some point, in my panic, I realized the creature was not trying to attack. It was almost as if it was hurting me, showing me a path away from its den and through the dense forest. The horrifying figure kept a distressing proximity, but didn't invade my space more than that, despite every natural instinct telling me to flee from the predatory figure trailing behind me. This bizarre direction it was offering seemed to be taking me back to civilization. I followed the strange path that led away from the nightmare behind me. After a moment, I eventually caught sight of the familiar Appalachian Trail. Relief washed over me. I can't even begin to describe how amazing I felt to be out of there. The creature followed me all the way to the forest's edge. I imagine it could have caught me if it wanted to, and yet here I was. As I slumped to the ground, panting with exhaustion and still shaken by the encounter, my mind raced through what just happened. Later, sitting in the comforting warmth of my living room, far away from the mountains of Appalachia, I began piecing together my encounter. I was left raw and endlessly grateful for the escape, but deeply unsettled by the whole thing. Every time I closed my eyes, I could still see that pale figure darting around the forest floor. My perspective on hiking has been forever altered, and my curiosity for the unknown has just about died. Nowadays, when I find myself hiking and camping, I never stray too far from the beaten path. That creature certainly isn't something I'd like to see again, and I'm afraid I might just run into it again if I venture too far into the wild. And if I did, would I be as lucky then? Or would the creature hunt me down in earnest? I'm incredibly curious if anyone else has encountered these creatures and possibly know what they want from us.